Okay, we're on Samach Beis Amud Beis. Here we go. We are on Samach Beis Amud Beis 62b1 towards the bottom of the first column. So the last thing we spoke about, one of the last things we spoke about was Rav Chisda, who said that we use the concept of Howell, not there, but the principle of other side, that since, right, we spoke about the fact that since a person could ultimately get circumcised, therefore it's they're going to be included in the group of people, right? If a person slaughters a Karban Pesach for a group of people, even though one of those people is uncircumcised, since he could get circumcised, he's actually going to be considered part of the group, and therefore it's going to cause an invalidation. So basically holds of the principle of since in a stringent fashion. Since something could happen, therefore it's going to be so in a stringent fashion. The Gemara is going to question this principle. Masr Huna Breder Rav Yeshua. HaPesach Sh'ar B'Shnaso. Okay, so one of the halachas we haven't seen yet inside, and that is that a Karban Pesach has to be, the animal has to be within 1 year. It has to be in its first year of birth. It can't be more than a year. Okay, fine. So let's say a person slaughters such an animal for a Karban Pesach, meaning one that is older than a year, okay? Or a person slaughters it on its time. A person slaughters it during its specific time. This animal that's more than a year old for its own sake. So a person is a 2-year-old lamb, and they slaughtered for a Karban Pesach on Erev Pesach, okay? Another case, or a person takes another type of offering. Let's say a person designated an animal for a chatas, and then they take that chatas, and on Erev Pesach, they shech it. They slaughter it for the sake of a Karban Pesach. Rabbi Eliezer posel. Rabbi Eliezer says it is invalid in all those cases. In both those cases, Rabbi Yeshua Machshir. Rabbi Yeshua says no. Both those cases, the animal reverts back to being a Karban Pesach, even though it's. Sorry, let me say that better. In the case where it's 2 years old, even though I'm having in mind for a Karban Pesach, it's going to be treated as a shlamim, right? In other words, it's invalid as a Karban Pesach once it's 2 years old. But nonetheless, Rabbi Yeshua says that it's going to now become a shlamim. And similarly, if I slaughter, let's say, a shchatas for a Karban Pesach, also it's going to become a shlamim in that moment. Fine. But Rabbi Eliezer says that in both those cases, it's going to be possible. Let's focus on the second one. He says if I go ahead and I take a chatas offering and I slaughter it on Erev Pesach for the sake of a Karban Pesach, it's going to be invalid if I do it on Erev Pesach, on the 14th. Okay, so says the Gemara now, stop in the next column, time of Bismano. Rabbi Eliezer is very clear that the reason it's invalid is because I'm slaughtering it as a Karban Pesach on the 14th. Hashalo bismano kasher. If I were to go ahead and slaughter this animal, this chatas or this shlamim, on the 13th of Nisan, okay, and I'm doing it for the same sake of a Pesach, what would happen is it would be kosher, right? He says it's only when I do it. Again, Rabbi Eliezer said it's when I do it on the 14th. Then I can't. The fact that I'm having it in mind for a Pesach is not going to be, is going to invalidate it. But if I have in mind for a Karban Pesach, I take a shlamim on the 13th of Nisan, and I slaughter for the sake of a Pesach on the 13th of Nisan, it will be a regular classic shlamim. No problem. It'll be okay. Ask the Gemara, why is that so? Name a hol of Bismano posel, since on the 14th it would be invalid, since if I were to do the same exact action on the 14th of Nisan, it would be invalid. Shalom bismano nami posel. The principle of since should say, okay, since on the 14th, if I slaughter the shlamim for the sake of a Pesach, it becomes a shlamim. So why? He says it's invalid. So why, if I do it on the 13th, if I do it on the 13th for the sake of a Pesach, it should also be invalid. Since if I were to do it on a different day, it would be invalid, right? Rav Chisda says we apply the principle of since stringently. So if I go ahead and slaughter this Karban shlamim on the 13th of Nisan for the sake of a Karban Pesach, Rav Eliezer says it's kosher. Ask the Gemara why. If we should apply the principle of since and say that since if I were to slaughter the same thing the next day, it would be invalid. So if I slaughter it now, it should also be invalid. The principle of sin should also invalidate it, and yet Rabbi Eliezer is saying that it does not invalidate. Okay, so the Gemara says, you see from here that the principle of sins should not apply in a stringent fashion. So Amar Papa, Rav Papa says, no, Shani Hasam, it's different. There's a unique reality when it comes to the Karban Pesach. Amar Krav Martem Zevach Pesachu, right? So we say this in the Agada. It is, we say this, and they say, and you shall say, this is, or it is the Pesach sacrifice. Hu Bahava Yaso. What that means is it is that it must be of this condition. What does that mean? What do we learn from this pasuk? We learn two things. Lo hu l'shem acherim. On Erev Pesach, when you are slaughtering, okay, you can't go ahead and slaughter your Karban Pesach with intention for it to be a shlamim. If you go ahead on Erev Pesach and you're shechting your Karban Pesach and you're thinking this is going to be a Karban shlamim, no good. V'lo acherim l'shmo. Or on Erev Pesach, if you're slaughtering a shlamim and you're doing it for the sake of a Pesach, also not good. Okay, so but basically you see the two are juxtaposed. You see that the Karban Pesach is juxtaposed, is juxtaposed to other karbanos being done for a Karban Pesach. So what do we see from there? Bismano, based on that we say, Bismano shu pasl shom acherim, on its own time, when it's invalid for the sake of others, acherim psul lishmo. Okay, so on its own time, meaning on Erev Pesach, on the 14th, on its proper time, when if you go ahead and you slaughter a Karban Pesach for the sake of a shlamim, it's invalid. And others are invalid for its sake. In other words, if you go ahead and you slaughter a shlamim for the sake of Pesach, on Erev Pesach, it's invalid. So similarly, shelo bismano, on the 13th or any other day of the year, shehu kashel l'shom acherim, just like it's valid, we'll see later on, that we're going to learn, that if a person goes ahead and slaughters what was designated as a Karban Pesach for a shlamim, it's going to be good. So similarly, acherim ksherim l'shmo, others are going to be valid for its sake. So basically we're going to say that if I go ahead and slaughter something else for a Karban Pesach, it's going to be good as well. The point is that the Gemara is saying that since the two are juxtaposed, the slaughtering a Karban Pesach for something else or something else for a Karban Pesach, so although normally the principle of Hoel should invalidate this Karban on the wrong day, but here since you have this principle, there's a specific pasuk about a Karban Pesach telling you that, juxtaposing the Karban Pesach and other Karbanos that are done for the sake of Karban Pesach, to teach me, one of the things that will come out is that if I shecht a non-Karban Pesach on the 13th of Nisan, for the sake of a Karban Pesach, it's going to be valid as a Karban Shlamim, and that is going to be learned out from this pasuk, and therefore that would override the principle of Hoel, which would normally apply. In other words, we're saying Rav Chisda still stands. Hoel would tell me that there would be an invalidation, but over here, based on this pasuk, it's going to be an exception to that rule. Okay, says the Gemara further. Okay, the Gemara says a relevant story. Rav Simlai asked the committee of Rav Yochanan. Rav Simlai came in front of Rav Yochanan. Okay, Amar lei nisni li mar sefer Yochsin. Teach me the book of Yochsin. Okay, the book of Yochsin was a commentary on Divrei Hayamim. Divrei Hayamim is all about genealogy. It's all about chronicles. It's all about basically a list of names. And Sefer Yochsin was a commentary on this, an extensive commentary, which we would call in modern times like Agadata. It was an extensive book of Agadata, of literature that explains Jewish philosophy, Jewish ideas. It was not written down necessarily at this point, according to many. It was an earlier time before the Gemara anything gets written down, but it was a collection of ideas which were known only by some of the sages. So Rav Simlai comes in front of Rav Yochanan and says, "Please teach me them." So Amarlei, Rav Yochanan says, "Mehechanat, where are you from?" Amarlei Milod. I'm from Lod. Vehechan Mosavach. And where do you live now? Ben Aharda. I live in Aharda. Amarlei Rav Yochanan says 62b2. Eini donin lo luludim v'lo l'nahardaim. We don't teach the book of Yochsin to people from Lod, nor do we teach it to people from Naharda. V'chol shkei da'at milod Mosavach ben Aharda. You have both things going against you. I'm not teaching it to you. Okay. So what in the world? What's that all about? So some say Rashi gives two pshatim. Rashi says one thing he just didn't want to teach to anyone. In other words, they were very cautious about you don't teach Torah to nowadays. We have a different reality for a whole host of reasons, where more or less anyone wants to learn, we basically teach them everything. They're much more limited in terms of who they teach things to. And you see actually from here, it's not just, it's very unique to when it comes to Agadata. Agadata is something which, on the one hand, people say, okay, the Agadei portions of the Gemara, they're very light, they're easy to learn. The truth is that we see from a Gemara like this, actually the most complex to learn. In other words, when it comes to halacha, there's a very clear system. This, you follow the logic and you can make sense of it. You can explain to someone whether they have orientation to Gemara or not. You can more or less understand. It'll take a little explaining, but there's a system. When it comes to Agadata, it's much more subtle, and therefore there's much more sensitivity around teaching it. But again, this just points out how significant and how we should approach Agadata. It's not just like, shooting from the hip. Maybe that means this, maybe it means that. But there is a system and there is a certain sensitivity and therefore tradition that they were very concerned about who to teach it to and who not to teach it to. Okay, bottom line is he was pushing him off. Okay, Kafi of Artse. Nonetheless, Rav Simlai pressured him and eventually he agreed. Okay, Amarlei Nisniye Bishloshi Archi. He says, okay, fine, now that you agreed, can we learn it in 3 months? Can we learn the whole thing? We Sefer Yochsin in 3 months. Okay, that made Rabbi Yochanan lose it. Shakal kala paslik vei. He took a clod of earth and he threw it at him. Okay. I don't know the significance of that, but the point is that he's like, you're out of your mind. Okay. And Amarlei, he gives him the following fascinating, reason. Tell him how off he is. He says, Uma bruria debisudra meir. Vartid Rav Chanan ben Tradion. Bruria, who is the wife of a mayor, and the daughter of Chanan ben Tradion. It's Tanya. tlas me'ah shmaitza b'yoma, who will learn 300 rulings a day, mitlas me'ah rabavsa, from 300 different teachers, va'afilu hachi lo yatzid echavas v'tlashnin. Nevertheless, she was unable to complete all of her studies of Sefer Yuchsin in 3 years. Okay, so you have this brilliant scholar, or scholaress, right? You have Bruria, the wife of her mayor, and the daughter of Reb Chanan Mitzrayim. The Yuchsin, by the way, it's not coincidental. We're mentioning her Yuchsin, her lineage, and saying that there's a merit over here in all of her Yuchsin, and nonetheless, she couldn't figure out this book. She was brilliant. She knew everything, and she learned from so many different people something that was so unique. Nonetheless, she couldn't accomplish this book in 3 years. And you say you want to finish in 3 months? Get out of here. Basically, he kind of just sends him off. Okay, fine. It's just fascinating. He invokes Bruri over here of all people. It's just like such a very unique thing. Obviously, this teaching of invoking Bruri over here relates to an extensive debate and discussion about women and Gemara learning, right? About there are Gemaras which in Sotza which speak about how there's a lot of challenges in doing so, and yet you have this Gemara Bruria about Bruria saying how much she learned, and this fascinating whatever. We don't have the time to get into it, but there's certainly this Gemara is invoked in that extensive discussion about Talmud Torah and women. Ironically, today it's okay. Fine. We'll be hearing from everyone. Okay. Kishakal va'azil. Okay, as Rav Savilai was leaving, Amarle, he said, Rebbe, okay, fine. You're not going to teach me Sefer Yochsin. Teach me the following, and this is why we quoted this over here. Ma bein l'shmo v'shelo l'shmo, la'ochlav v'shelo la'ochlav. What's the difference between a Pesach offering that when you slaughter it for its sake and not for its own sake, it's invalid, whereas when you slaughter it for those who are going to eat and those who are not going to eat, it is valid? Right? We saw this. So what's the difference? Why in one case is it invalid and one case is it valid? Okay? So Amarle, Hovatzur Merabananat Tav Emalach. He says, listen, I don't want to teach you Sefer Yuchsin because you're out of your mind, but you are a rabbinical student. This thing I'll teach you. Right? Again, we see that comes to halacha. It's easier to learn halacha than it is to learn Haggadah. Don't be confused by the easy nature of the Haggadah passages. It's actually much harder to learn. But here he says, this I could teach you. And so he calls Rav Sinai back and he tells him a bunch of distinctions between Lishma and L'shlo Lishma, and L'ochla v'shlo L'ochlav. He says, Lishmo v'Lishlo Lishmo, which, again, if a person slaughters the Karban Pesach, both for the sake of, while I'm slaughtering, I'm thinking, I'm doing this for Karban Pesach, and I'm doing this for the sake of a Shlamim, at the same time, right? So, there it's worse. Why? Psula begufo. First of all, invalidation is in the sacrifice itself. It's about the animal. L'ochla v'shlo L'ochlav, and Psula begufo. When I'm slaughtering it for those who are eating and not eating it, it's about something that's incidental. It's what's going to happen next. It's not like about the animal. It's like who's going to eat this later, right? It's not in the thing itself. Lishmo, therefore, again, Lishma v'shelo lishma is more stringent. Lishmo v'shelo lishma yav shalavar isuro. When it comes to for its sake and not for its own sake, you can't ever point to parts of the karban. If I say I'm slaughtering this karban for the sake of Pesach and for the sake of Shlamim, I can't say, oh, the right side is for Shlamim, the left side is for Pesach. There's no logical way of doing that. However, l'ochlav v'shelo l'ochlav yav shalavar isuro. When it comes to those who eat it and those who don't eat it, you could say, okay, listen, there's 10 people included. Some of them are people eating. Some of the people are not eating. You could say this right leg is going to be for the people who are eating. Those for the people not eating, you could conceivably distinguish between different parts of the animal. Okay. There you go, exactly. Lishmo v'shelo lishmo yeshna ba'arba avodos. When it comes to lishma, it's relevant to the 4 avodos. Remember, we said there are different stages to the. There's the slaughtering, there's the capturing of the blood, there's the walking the blood, there's the sprinkling of the blood. And if at any moment in general you have a shelo lishma thought, it will invalidate the gemara. The karban. La'ochla v'shelo la'ochlav ein ba'arba avodos. When it comes to those who eat and those who don't eat, the invalidation is only in the slaughtering. Okay, if you have intention during the sprinkling alone, or during the walking of the blood, it's going to be for the people who are not going to eat, it doesn't invalidate it. So you see that in general, lishma is more stringent. Again, lishmo v'lishlo lishmo, yeshno mitzira kev'yachid. When it comes to for its sake and not for its own sake, that is an invalidation which applies to both a karban yachid and a karban tzibur, communal offering and a individual offering. However, when it comes to this invalidation of those who are able to eat it and those unable to eat it, it's only limited to the karban pesach, which is a individual type offering. It is not right, and therefore, again, you see another stringency for lishmo lishma, and therefore, the bottom line is you see lishmo lishma in general is much more stringent, and therefore you can understand why it's going to be treated much more stringently in this respect when a person has both those intentions and invalidates Karban Pesach, whereas sh'ochlav v'shlo ochlav does not invalidate the Karban Pesach. Rav Ashi just makes a comment about out the last list. Psula begufa v'yavshel levar yisuro chada milsehi. Okay, when we say although Rabbi Yochanan listed 4 things, he points out that 2 of those are actually really one and the same. The psul saying that it's intrinsic and that you can't separate them out, it's really one and the same. Why? Why is it that invalidation is the sacrifice itself? Because it's not possible to identify the prohibited portion, and therefore it's because it's in the animal, it's the entirety of the animal. That's why you can't separate the 2 from one another, and therefore the point is the list is 3, not 4, but the point still stands. Okay, the Gemara gets back to the book of Yochsin. Amar Rami Barav Yuda Amar Rav Miyom Shenigdas Sefer Yochsin, from the day that Sefer Yochsin was forgotten, although it says hidden. Again, it wasn't written in written form according to Rashi, from the day it was forgotten. Some say it was written. Just parenthetically, I'll just mention there's another approach over here, and some say Sefer Yochsin, in addition to the Gadata, also had actual discussion about who is appropriate to Yochsin, who has appropriate lineage and not, and that goes back to why he didn't want to teach someone from Lud and Arda, because in Lud and Arda, the people were not so meyuchas. They had questions about the Yochsin. By the way, it also mentioned a reason why when it speaks to Bruria, it says who she's married to and who her father is to describe her yuchsin. And the reason they hid it according to this approach is because people who did have good yuchsin were quite upset, and they were actually quite powerful, and there was a threat to the rabbis' lives. And therefore, they actually hid this whole book or stopped teaching it entirely because the fact that it had negative ramifications to their lives. There was a risk, and therefore they said, let's just move this away because we can't deal with the ramifications. Okay, so when that happens, Tashash, again, that's alternative approach. Tashash kochan shel chachamim, the strength of the sages became weak. The cham or name, and their eyesight was dimmed. Again, this, whether it has parts of it which were lineage, it still was a sefer of agada, and to recognize that when we lost those teachings, it impacted the sages. Okay, Amar Marzutra, bein atzel la'atzel, between the words atzel and atzel. Okay, those are 2 words. Rashi says the words atzel and atzel are referring to one in the 8th parak of Pirkei Avos, and the next word atzel in the 9th parak of Pirkei Avos. Most argue and say no, there's one pasuk where atzel is the beginning of the pasuk and atzel is the end of the pasuk, meaning in one pasuk alone, ta'inu arba me'a gamli de drasha, they hold 400 camel load worth of expositions. In other words, there were so many drashas. In other words, Sefer Yochsin was jam-packed with drashas, with expositions, and we lost it. In other words, it wasn't just a small thing, a few teachings, but even between atzel and atzel, whether it's in one parak, as Rashi said, or as the others argue, even within one pasuk, there were, again, this is just a hyperbolic way of saying this, but there were 400 camel loads worth of expositions, basically saying there was an endless amount of teachings, and we lost all those teachings when we lost Sefer Yochsin. Okay, the Gemara concludes over here. We'll pick up Meretz Shem tomorrow.